I am Ann Tucker. I'm a business law professor at Georgia State College of Law in Atlanta. And part of my research portfolio focuses on impact investment funds. With that, I get to be involved in a research project through the IFRC, the Impact Finance Research Consortium, which is a collaboration between Chicago's Booth School, Penn's Wharton School of Business, and Harvard's Business School. And through that, we are collecting fund manager surveys, legal documents, and financial reports from impact funds to build a comprehensive data set or picture of what funds, what the deal terms are, what the performance is, and how managers are thinking about scoping their deals, and what impact is continuing to evolve into in the space. So that is some of the background that I bring to this conversation. But with us, we have three panelists working in different parts of the impact ecosystem. And I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves, and then we'll move into our set of questions. So on this panel, we'll be talking about preparing for impact, training lawyers for ESG, impact investing, and social entrepreneurship. And each of our panelists has a lot of personal and professional experience to share with us, as we'll be talking about their journeys, but then also trying to chart a path for the next generation of impact professionals. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, and maybe Anna, you can start the introductions with you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizers for including me in this interesting panel. My name again is Anna Demel. I hail from Puerto Rico. I was an NYU law student. Then I practiced law at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton for more than 20 years. And when I decided that had been enough time in a law firm, I retired from the firm and began teaching as an adjunct at NYU, and became as well very involved with a nonprofit organization very dear to my heart called Mujer. At NYU, I began, interestingly enough, teaching a class about microfinance, and my experience before then in microfinance had been doing pro bono work from Cleary for Mujer, actually. And one thing that taught me was how the worlds are all connected. The things you learn practicing law at a big law firm are useful to the things you need to know to help a social enterprise or a nonprofit like Mujer. The things that you learn from that life are useful when you try to teach about microfinance and about social development and the intersection of all those worlds. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm sure other parts of my experience will come up as we chat about the topic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shuangjun Wang. I'm a sixth-year associate at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. I grew up in California and then moved to New York for work after law school at Harvard. I started my practice in doing capital markets and corporate governance, and ESG sort of slowly became the focus, and now sort of the life of my career, it seems like. So I've done a lot of work in this space. It's ever changing. It's very exciting. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you and with these amazing panelists.
And last but not least, Mateo.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Mateo. Today, I'm very happy to be here. I started off working at Skadden's Latin American practice group about 15 years ago. I did some time there doing cross-border transactions. I was in-house counsel at BTG Pactual, continue to do sort of cross-border US, Latin America transactions covering sort of private equity, capital markets, strategic M&A, but perhaps most importantly, maybe most relevant for this, about 7 years ago, I was one of the founding employees of a late-stage growth private equity fund. We had with an ESG mandate, and so part of the practice, among the many things that we were dealing with at the time, was sort of developing an ESG program and sort of building it up over the course of the last years. And then And then recently, I joined the U.S. Development Finance Corporation here in Washington, D.C. I'm an assistant general counsel. I should also say that my views that I'm going to express today are those of my own and not of the DFC. But it's been a brand new experience. I'd love to talk about it, but to be honest, I've been here for the all of 2 months, and so I'm still getting my. You can see there's still no artwork up in the office behind me, and so we're still moving in. But it's been an incredible experience so far, and so I'm really happy to talk about a little bit what I'm doing now, but certainly what I've been doing, over the last 7 years in the ESG space.
Great. Well, thanks for those introductions, folks. And just to give the folks that are viewing this panel and here for the conversation, a little bit of a framework for the conversation that we're going to have. One of the things that we want to talk about is how, as impact investing and social enterprise moves into the mainstream, how is that creating enforcing changes within law firms, with companies that are working, and also with the law schools. So thinking about how has the industry forced changes, particularly for lawyers practicing in these different areas. So I want to start with just a basic first question, and wanting to know, like, how has your individual role, how has it changed as ESG and impact investing has grown? So I'm curious what your individual experiences are with this, how you've seen the field evolve and how your roles have changed. And Shuangjun, I'd love to start with you, because you said you started in capital markets and now your whole practice is primarily focused on ESG. And I think that hits on this idea that this is no longer a pro bono practice like it was for Anna's work, but now that you've seen that evolution. So I'd love for you to kick us off and share that story about how you've seen your practice change.
Absolutely. So when I started as a first year, and that was the first time I'd heard about ESG, and it was always in the context of, we don't, in terms of our billable clients, we don't do a lot of work in this space. And to the extent it impacts, these large companies, they're sort of these smaller single issue ESG investors. It hadn't even really gotten on the radars of these large institutional investors. And so it was always maybe a side thought, an afterthought. It wasn't the focus. And gradually in the last few years, people, the market, companies have really started and really focused on more and more parts of ESG. And I think one of the biggest things I've seen is that companies have started to have these sustainability teams that are completely devoted to this space. And with that, lawyers are also trying to, keep up and make sure that we're also advising companies in the best way that we can as they're exploring and progressing through all of these ESG issues that come up. And I think one of the really great parts of my work is that because the space is so dynamic and it changes and it evolves so quickly and so often, there's an answer that I give to a client today may be a stale or outdated answer tomorrow. And so we always have to be very creative about, how do we push the boundaries? How do we move forward with this in a space where the regulatory landscape is also trying to keep up, and it's a lot slower than how the market is progressing. And so I think it is a really interesting space where everyone's sort of running forward, trying to do the best they can, and we're all trying to get ahead, right, to make sure that we're doing this in the most effective and productive way possible.
I love that comment about the shelf life of your advice, sort of like, this is a moving target. Here's what we know today, and here's our best guess for tomorrow. And also, I think your comments about how the regulatory environment is also reacting to this. There's been a spate of climate change disclosures, ESG fund rules that are now on the table. And I think it's really highlights that this is a dynamic area of the law that is changing in real time. So thank you for those comments. Anna, let's hear from you how your time span is a little bit longer and it involves different moves for you, but can you say a little bit about how you see legal practice changing or in this space?
Yeah, but before I do that, I'd love to react to the comments that you just made. Just the other day, I was with a team from Mujer at the Cleary offices, and Cleary is helping us put together a fund that will be investing in women-led small businesses in Latin America. And one thing that I noticed was that the Cleary team, which as I would have always expected, was brilliant and super helpful. Very different from when I did pro bono work for microfinance organization many years ago. They were speaking from the work that they're doing every day. They had expertise that was relevant already. It wasn't like, wow, listen, there's this new thing, social enterprise doing financial inclusion, and let me learn something new, and it's exciting for me and gratifying as a person, and using new skills, but rather the skills that they're using already in their day-to-day work were already relevant and useful to a microfinance or a social enterprise financial inclusion effort. And it was wonderful to see the world sort of I wouldn't say that they're met quite yet. Far from it, I think we have a ways to go before the worlds are really quite intertwined, but they're getting closer. Concerns about impact, concerns about thinking about all the stakeholders, what the social enterprises are engaged in, funds and raising capital in the capital markets, which was unheard of when I started to hear about this, are now, as this conference attests, right, common conversation. And so it's a wonderful thing to see the worlds interacting. And I'm a big believer that the more interaction and collaboration there is between the worlds, the more efficient we can be, the more effective we can be. So it's really great to see. And so today, a young lawyer can develop skills and develop knowledge that are helpful and useful for many areas, the pure, profit-seeking world and the social enterprise world and even the philanthropic world. And I think that's really great to see. I mean, when I started, in a way, things have not changed, right? Clients always had reputation to worry about, but now that has a completely different quality to it, a depth to it, risks to it that were not really front of mind when I began. And so it's wonderful to see, I think, the evolution and hopefully I think would make for much more rewarding careers, even for those lawyers who remain in the mainstream sort of Wall Street environment.
Great, thank you. So Mateo, what would you add to this? How have these changing roles, how have you seen it shape your roles, and how do you see the field changing?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that Shuangjun and Anna said that resonated deeply. I think one from Shuangjun is we're trying our best, which is, for me, it's, what has ESG done to the GC, CCO sort of legal department in the mid-market sort of growth, private equity, private debt world. It has made a very, fairly challenging role and seat like that much more sort of complex, especially if sort of the principals of the firm are sort of looking to the legal department, GC, whoever it is, to sort of manage the program where there's not a sort of dedicated ESG component, ESG sort of personnel. But so for me, 2007, 7 years ago, 2014, 15, we were starting to build out this private equity fund, and we got a phone call, And I said, we're trying to launch a fund, which was it's a drinking out of a fire hose. We're trying to build out the legal compliance function. We're negotiating limited partnership agreements among the principals of the firm. We're getting to do our first deal. And then I get a phone call and say, the anchor investor wants to see our ESG policy. And I'm like, what do you, okay. So of course I give a phone call to our fund counsel. I'm like, hey, I need an ESG policy. And, when I'm sure for, with respect to our esteemed colleagues in the big law, I'm sure for $5,000, they gave me an ESG policy, which was all of 5 sentences, and said something along the lines of, we care about, ESG related matters in our investment process. So that was, that's where we started. And then, 7 years later, like, what does that mean to actually operation? Even if the policy itself doesn't get longer, what does it mean to actually operationalize an ESG program at a, mid-market fund where everybody in the, on the team is carrying quite a bit of water. And so for the legal department, I found it's very rewarding. And Diana's point is like adding sort of depth, complexity, reward to your career. But at the same time, there are so many components to like a properly run, a real ESG program, even if you're not holding yourself out as a sort of an ethical investor, but you believe, from an investment perspective that these are real risks that affect the bottom line, and you want to take these sort of considerations seriously. So, how, if the lawyer is being tasked with building out this program, first thing to ask, okay, we have this policy, fine, let's say, how are we going to operationalize? First thing, what are the questions to ask? Like, this is not a straightforward process for a legal department, investment professionals. You have a sense of it. We've been trained from day one as attorneys, risk, that we have the core foundational skills, but the questions to ask, when we're thrown in as first-year associates, compliance with laws, are they paying their folks minimum wage? Not questions of, are they treating their people fairly? Do they pay a fair wage? What is the sort of how is the general relations with their employment? You may discuss it, from a traditional sort of labor relations perspective, like labor unions and the like, but these are completely different questions that, right out the gate, it's not even clear what the questions to ask. And so you have to build out the question list. You have to decide, are you going to engage third-party advisors? Are you going to produce work product? What is the role of the legal department? Am I producing an ESG report that I'm going to report to the IC prior to doing this? It's not necessarily straightforward. How are you dealing with risks? Like, that's the, it's okay, fine. We asked all the perfect questions. We engaged our advisors. We put together this big report. So what are we going to do with that? These are very difficult questions to ask. And, who's responsible? What's the governance on your side? Does a portfolio manager have the responsibility, the ability to sign off on risk? Does it go to the IC? Does it go to a committee of the IC? These are sort of all the components of an ESG program that, from my experience, it's like, they're really looking to the legal department to manage something like this. And, it can be, there's a lot of sort of additional resources. And that's why when Shuangjun says we're trying our best, it's, this is not necessarily straightforward. It's a tall ask.
So, and I should have said this at the outset, but to the extent that panelists want to respond to anything that anybody says, please feel free to treat this like a conversation. I'll pepper in some questions here and there, maybe solicit individual perspectives, but I really appreciated, Anna, that you spoke directly to what Shuangjun was saying and then brought in the remarks that you were going to make anyway. So you all have commented on the changes that you've identified, not only in your own roles, but sort of in the spaces around you. And I've also heard each of you saying that the changes aren't just in the roles, but even in what we mean by ESG and what are some of the definitional boundaries. So I'm curious, in light of all this, all of this change that you've identified, how are law firms, law schools, and general counsel's offices rising to this challenge? Where are you seeing innovation, and where do you see opportunities for more innovation?
Well, I can speak to that if you like.
Please, yeah, that'd be great.
I'll speak just from my own role as an adjunct professor at NYU. I teach 3 classes, and I'll speak about 2 of them in this context, or maybe even the 3. One is project finance, and It's a class that is very much focused on the traditional project financing, which I'm sure everybody knows, but just in case, it's how you do financings of very big, typically infrastructure projects, where you allocate the risk among everyone participating, where no one takes the risk of the project on their balance sheet, but rather you rely on the project itself to generate enough revenue to pay for itself. And in that class, we really follow a very traditional project finance model. We look at contracts that are used traditionally in project finance, and all the contracts have, compliance with law requirements. They have environmental reps and warranties. They have things that relate to protecting the environment. But really, I think I personally have fallen short in how to incorporate sort of more up-to-date concepts of ESG in the thinking of the students on how you put a project together. And this is only a semester apart from when I teach a class called The Law and Business of Social Enterprise, where all we do is focus on social enterprise, what it means to have impact, how you measure impact, how you reflect the obligation to produce, if you will, in covenants that make sense, the governance of social enterprises. And so even in one person, me, this is a confessional, I see that we have a long way to go between the classes that really you're very thoughtful about ESG and very forward-looking. I'd like to think about what it means to be a social enterprise, to think about all the stakeholders, and the more traditional classes like my project finance class, where we don't ignore ESG. I mean, we talk about the equator principles, we talk about the different stakeholders, but the emphasis is very different. And so I think there's room there for improvement in terms of when we look at sort of traditional financing methods like project finance, in raising consciousness and in helping the future lawyers be great issue spotters in terms of ESG at a minimum. So that's my.
Yeah. In the panel right before us, one of the themes was about integration, that the areas for growth are when the idea of impact investment, social enterprise, and ESG is more fully integrated into traditional markets and how we think about deals. And so your comments about there's the class that focuses on doing the deal, and then there's the class that focuses on how to insert ESG into those types of deals. And that what you're naming is sort of how to continue to think about bridging that gap.
Right, because I think, and my experience, and I don't know if others that are in academia share it, but the students that come with a great interest in social enterprise and doing good in the world will naturally show up in the classes where that's being taught. But I think it behooves us that those topics show up in every class, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's just, part of the covenant package or part of the governance structure, that it should be part of that conversation. I think would be good.
Yeah, so I'll comment on one other thing, and then I will kick it back over to the rest of our official panelists. But another thing that really had me thinking on the last panel was the idea of pipeline. Like who gets to work in these spaces from the law firm side, who gets to work in the funds. And I'm thinking about expanding beyond a handful of law schools that are deemed like the feeder schools. But your comment makes me think also about how do you build a pipeline? It's not just where we look, it's who we are educating and building awareness about not only practice areas, but just simply this component to a business law practice, and thinking about raising awareness among students who don't come to law school primed for, or who aren't primed for this and who aren't already seeking it out, and educating everybody that's going to be practicing law, not just the students who self-select as already interested. So lots of connections there. So I'm curious, Mateo, Shuangjun, where do you see innovation that's working, and where do you see opportunities for more improvement?
So I really want to touch back on what you said, but what Anna said about the fact that ESG should be included and integrated into sort of everything, right? All of the different practices. And as you said, I think the self-selection is really helpful for people who are interested in this already. But I think the main issue we have is that ESG is so pervasive through everything that it really behooves any person wanting to practice law to have at least a working knowledge about how it impacts any area of law that you might be interested in. Because it is not a siloed sort of, at least I don't think of ESG as a siloed practice area. ESG is integrated into my capital markets practice. It's integrated into my corporate governance practice. It's integrated into my general securities and advisory work that I do for clients. It shows up in deals. If I'm doing a green bond or a sustainability linked bond for a client, it shows up in in the boardroom. It shows up at management tabletop exercises. It really runs the gamut. And so I think, to Anna's point earlier, the innovation here, and I think where lawyers have really had to step up, is to go beyond the scope of, I know the law, I studied case law in law school, and, I know the answers, and here's what I do. You really have to be very courageous about stepping outside of that comfort zone and having, I would say, an inextinguishable curiosity and creativity about, how do we tackle these issues and how do I learn more? And understanding that, you might know a lot, but at least for me, I don't think of myself on the day-to-day as an ESG expert, even though this is the bulk of what I do, because there's always more to learn. The scope is so large, and I might be very familiar with the new proposed climate disclosure rules that the SEC just came out with, but I'm not as familiar with everything that's going on in the EU or in Asia and other parts of the world. But those rules and regulations, work with other jurisdictions. It's all interconnected. And so, I think shedding that mindset of, I'm going to stay in my own lane, and I know the things that I know, and this is what I'm comfortable with. I think that is really detrimental for lawyers in this practice. You really want to think about how you can build up substantive expertise in the areas that you can, but also be brave about learning about new areas and understanding the limitations of what you know, and reaching out to other experts in these areas and other areas so that you're working together. Because at the end of the day, I think the big difference I've seen in law firms is that, we're not just being asked legal questions anymore. And this goes to Mateo's point earlier, we're being asked to step into more business roles and thinking about business risks and how do we even lead up the ESG charge, as even though we're lawyers, but it's a shift in this traditional legal practice. And I think the people who I've seen really succeed and shine in this space are the ones who are, always curious and always creative about how to push that envelope further.
Great. I think I'm going to take one of your trains of thought there as a shift from thinking about I have the answer or I have the right answer to I ask the right questions. And that's certainly something, as a professor, I try and encourage students to think about, but I love that as an idea. Mateo, what would you add to this?
I think to add a positive spin on what's going on in the education right now, both at the law schools and it's been a long time since I've been in law school. I think it was 15 years ago since I graduated, but I enjoy, on a whim, I signed up for an executive master's in public administration 2 years ago. I'm so close to finishing this at NYU. And So I've gotten back into the educational, the world in the last couple of years, and I'm blown away, frankly, both from that, I've seen what the law schools are doing too, but also on the, at Wagner, in the program that's led by Scott Tatel, in terms of the availability of very interesting classes on the intersection of business, impact, law, courses where you can really spend time learning the variety of metrics that are out there. What are all the challenges that social enterprises themselves face? I mean, this is something that for me has been fairly remarkable to see, the sort of like just long course. And I take Anna's and Chenji's point very well, which is ESG, it's indistinguishable. But for those that want to go the extra step and really sort of like lean in and embrace impact and just make impact itself sort of a big part of the practice, like these programs are fairly remarkable. And on the law school, what I've seen, and I remember, I shudder to think about what a useless attorney I was in the first year of practice. And I don't want to think about what my time was built out on, is the practical training that's coming out of the law schools right now. And Deborah Brand wrote about this in a recent law review article talking about the case study method. And there's going to be a whole session on the microbuild case study, which is it's just remarkable that you can think that something that is being used for schools is being used now and also in the professional setting in a conference like this, where we probably have people that are long in the teeth that actually want to delve into the materials that have been included in that. And that's that microbuild case study from Deborah and Scott is a remarkable piece of work there for all levels. And so it's amazing to me. I remember that my practical experience in my, I don't want to denigrate my law school. It's a great law school. I had a great experience, and this is like 2003, fine, things were different. But our practicum in securities regulation, I remember this day very clearly, like, okay, section 5, you got to register, prospectus. And then the professor walks in one day with a prospectus. It was a written prospectus, and we just sort of like passed it around. We're like, oh, this is a prospectus. Kind of like turn it around. You see the red herring line. Like that was the practicum. And then we go on the theory. When do you have to register? And that's what was, that was the semester. And I remember my first day at Skadden was a Saturday, because I got called, and I didn't have a BlackBerry then. I'm like, how did you get my phone number? And they called me, and they brought me in the office at like 9 a.m. on a Saturday. And they said, we're launching the roadshow on Monday. Here's the offering memorandum. Send your comments. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I don't even know where to begin to start, like, mark up an offering memorandum. I'm like, okay, they're going to 144A deal. I'm like, okay, I guess this is kind of like the perspective. So anyway, but I go fast forward now, and I see something like materials like this microbuild case study out there, where like, we're pulling like long form fund documents and investment documentation in the back of these. I mean, it's fairly, we're a long ways from, 2007 when I graduated. So that's a little positive note there on the schooling.
Yeah. Well, I think we can all agree that this conference gives us lots of good examples of where innovation is happening. And like who's doing it right. And Deborah and Scott are certainly leaders in the field for a reason, because of their deep commitment. But I'm curious, you all have in different ways expressed that you've learned on the job, that your ESG and impact expertise is one that was gained through experience, not just through studying. So what do you think helped you to learn on the job? And when you're thinking about hiring folks to work on your teams and with you, what are you looking for? What combination of either skills and experiences or qualities, attributes would you be looking for?
Well, I'll give a couple of ideas, because if Mateo, your school experience was, as you describe it, you can only imagine mine so many years before the first loan. I had the same experience. Here's a loan agreement, give us your comments. And I had no comments because I had never seen a loan agreement before. And I tell my students this, all my students, you will not have that same experience when you arrive at a law firm or if that's where you go, because you will have seen a loan agreement here in my classroom. But I think curiosity, I think a passion for the field, or at least enthusiasm for the field, an ability to think outside the box, and an ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other people that are participating in a transaction. And I think in this area, a little patience, I think, is critical. The answers, as was said before, are not all there. I mean, I'll describe one conversation I had with the then General Counsel of Mujer, where Bolivia issued new law that would regulate us, and the law called for regulation. And the regulation took years to be promulgated because the country did not have the wherewithal to staff a committee to write the regulation. And so you were literally working in the blind. And so you have to be courageous, as you said, but also very thoughtful, very patient, and really try to think from everyone's perspective. I mean, you're dealing with perhaps with people who are used to doing business a certain way and are trying to do better or different, but are not there yet. It takes time. You can't change things overnight necessarily. And issue spotting, which I actually think law schools are great at teaching. That's even I confess 36 years ago when I graduated, one skill you definitely left law school with was being a good issue spotter, thinking about the different repercussions of one act and how it relates to the other. And so I think those are the basic skills that you need to, and the willingness to learn. And I think that will do it. I do.
Maybe I'll jump in with a less, I have a more formal, I have a, curiosity. I love, at this point, and then Shuangjun has expressed that too in separate discussions. But there's also a non-sexy element of the ESG program, which is, it's a policy that you are, if you're an investment manager, you have to listen to me, I'm preaching here, but the best approach from my perspective is if you treat it as a real policy that you will hold yourself to and expect your regulators and your limited partners to hold yourself to, you take off, the shine comes off of it a little bit, of course, but it means that sort of the skill sets, and your question is like, what are you looking for? Is like, I would be looking for, if I were hiring in a mid-market firm, is like somebody you can write a policy, you can write a procedure, you understand how to test your own policy, how to document that you complied with your own policy. What are the questionnaires that we're asking for these kind of industries? How have I documented that I've done it? It's not sexy stuff, but this is the kind of stuff, and I think for good reason, that regulators are looking and they want to see that you are doing what you say you do. And it's not so easy because all registered investment advisors in the mid-market and the same investment strategy have pretty much the same compliance manual. I mean, there's some flexibility here and there in terms of like holding periods in your PA statements and your PA trades, but it's not like, it's not that creative. Here, it's like all over the place. You're going to ask 50 managers, are going to have 50 different approaches to ESG, but you still have to paper it, and it still has to be documented. And it's going to be a very bespoke thing. Unfortunately, you can't really call your fund counsel and ask them for the ESG policy. It's very specific to how your people think about risk and how they're dealing with risk. And so, to take it back, like I want somebody who, to Anna's point, somebody who's curious, somebody who's very interested in this, but at the same time, like, okay, also you're somebody who's willing to do like the somewhat unglamorous work of like papering a policy and papering compliance with it, your own policy.
I love that point, Mateo, that this is still a part of the practice of law, and that it requires that same level of diligence and rigor, documentation. And it's not about an aspiration, it's about an implementation. And that shift and thinking about who has the mindset and the skill set to move from an aspiration to implementation. I think it's great. What would you add, Shuangjun? And this is probably, I don't know who all, we have 140 participants. I'm sure some people would love to join a team with you or a team like yours. So what advice can you give them about what you might be looking for?
I echo everything Anna and Mateo said. I agree with all of it because I think it's very important to come with an open mind, with curiosity, with creativity, but also patience. I think that patience point is very important. You know, I think oftentimes looking at the big picture, you know, we get really excited about, here are all of the things that we're doing. We're making a difference. We want to make a difference. We want to make a positive impact. But the fact is, to Mateo's point as well, lawyers are increasingly not just being asked for, you know, legal advice in the abstract. We're being asked to operationalize that advice and really work with clients to, you know, okay, you gave us this recommendation. Now, how do we actually implement this? You know, how do we put this into practice? And what advice do you have for us? You know, and it extends beyond the legal team at clients. You know, we work with the business folks, we work with the product folks, we work with the finance and the treasury folks, we work with the investor relations folks now. And it's a really broad scope of a lot of key stakeholders. And I think for people looking to be in this space, I would say, you know, it's helpful if you already know substantive knowledge about climate or social, you know, ESG substantive topics, but it's not necessary. You know, I think really going back to the basics, like Anna and Mateo were saying, the critical thinking skills, the issue spotting skills that you learn in law school, those have served me so well in my job, because a lot of times clients are really just asking, look, you know, we have this new problem, this new issue that came up, and we don't know if anyone else is dealing with it right now, but we are, and we don't know how to deal with it. We need you to help us think through this issue. Like, how do we problem solve something that doesn't have an easy answer, that might not have any answer, and doesn't have that comfort of being a well-regulated space where there are rules and guidance from, you know, these agencies to tell you, yes, you're okay, or no, you're towing the line, you know. And so we really have to be, I think, also comfortable with uncertainty and comfortable making those risk analysis judgments and making recommendations that are helpful for clients, both from a legal perspective, but also what's practical, what's, you know, what makes business sense. Because there's the conservative, well, to be safe on the legal side, I can give you this answer, but if that's not something they can implement, you know, not every company is a best practice company. You know, you just really need to be good enough. And I think that's one of the really important mindsets here, because as I said earlier, you know, we're trying our best, but it takes time, to Anna's point. You know, we're not going to save the world tomorrow. And it's always a work in progress, and sort of, you know, keeping that momentum and persevering, even when you feel like things are going really slowly, is a really helpful attitude.
Yeah, I love that comment about finding comfort when there aren't clear rules or bright lines. And the phrase, like the safety of a sure shipwreck, the idea of like, we almost want to know where the failure point is, so then we can steer around it. But when the waters are a lot murkier, that accepting and calculating of risk. I also love the comment about judgment. I'm going to read the CLE code for folks that are listening. I'll mention this again at the end of the panel. And we've also got a couple of questions from the panelists. So let me attend to these few housekeeping matters, and then we can continue on with our conversation. So the CLE code is 7R as in run, 4-1 N as in Nancy. And I can also put that into, I'll put it up on the Q&A screen if participants can see that as well. But we do have both a question and a comment from our participants. So the question posed is, how can we best train newer lawyers to address pressures for greenwashing by clients? And what proactive and positive role can lawyers play generally to steer clients away from greenwashing? So to Shuangjun's point that not everybody's going to be a best practice, but to what extent can lawyers help promote a positive evolution? And I'm curious what our panelists have to say, but we had one comment from another participant, Bjorn Sorensen, who noted that that there are professional rules of responsibility, Rule 2.1, that says in rendering advice, a lawyer may refer not only to the law, but to other considerations such as moral, economic, social, psychological, and political factors that may be relevant to a client's situation. So just there, that's one piece that might be in part answer to the question posed by Sherry Ross, Sherry Rossoff. But I'm curious, what have the panelists encountered pressures or seen pressures for greenwashing? Do you have your own personal anecdotes or thoughts about what the anecdote might be?
I can start this one. Greenwashing is a big issue that we work with clients. And sometimes you do have to give maybe not the happiest or most welcome advice to clients on this topic. But I really do appreciate Jorn's contribution, because I do think in this space where the regulation and the law is playing catch up, a lot of the risk analysis is not so much, oh, here's this black letter law that we're going to run against, but rather here are social risks, here are economic and financial risks, and we're looking at a much broader pool of stakeholders. I think traditionally companies are just worried about their largest investors and financial performance, and then long-term shareholder value return, which is, how much is our stock going to go up? But now, you're also looking at proxy advisors. You're also looking at other key stakeholders in the market. And investors are also looking not just at, the sort of immediate financial returns, but they are looking at ESG from a broader sort of scope and in different perspectives. And so you do have to also take into account when you're running these risk analyses and making recommendations for clients, if you do X and that's getting pretty close to greenwashing. Now, what are those, how is that going to impact your business? How is that going to impact your reputation? How is that going to impact any future, ESG initiatives that you as a company might want to do, or particular need now, because in the US we have this new proposed rule from the SEC. When you are actually going to be held accountable from a disclosure perspective for all of this, how are you going to frame that narrative, and how does that change some of the business strategies? And so it really is stepping outside of that narrow legal scope of my job and really, entering these different roles and putting on different hats to really help advise clients on a more holistic, scale, to give them, I think, hopefully better advice about, greenwashing and sort of making decisions that make sense for the company, but also is balanced with, let's actually, if you're going to try and make positive impacts, let's make sure that those are actually hitting.
Jump in here from the in-house, unless Anna, you want to.
Go ahead.
Good. So from the in-house perspective, I'll say I went, I would go to these compliance conferences when I wore the CCO hat as well, and they're almost like, they felt like these self-help support groups, these compliance officers. It's like a hard job, and you get together and they'd be like, yeah, okay, the new regulation, and you're pushing back with your internal guys. And so they were wonderful conferences. And I went to one where it's like, something like 500-600 people attending. And, one of the speakers got up and said, look, life is too short. If you don't have a team of professionals, principals that are fully behind believing that compliance is an important part of the job, like, move on with life. There is nothing you as a CCO are going to do to move. You can't just single-handedly move an institution that doesn't believe in this. And I think from the ESG impact greenwashing perspective, it's the same thing. There's no, you can say whatever you want to say in terms of when you're blue in the face, but if the institution itself and the principals, the individuals involved don't believe it's a serious thing, think it's a marketing event, so on and so forth, there's only so much you can do. I mean, integrating ESG is like you are working with the investment team. If they're not taking it seriously, like, whoa, it's hard to do. So the question is very good, but I think also, and Shuangjun's response is like she has very practical and ways to reframe things and ways to think about it. But if it's going to fall on deaf ears, like, it's something that, lawyers moving in-house need to be discerning about. I was lucky in terms of the people I worked with, but some people will say this is it's part of the marketing department, the ESG department, and that's it. And if it's something that you're taking seriously, it's very unlikely, I think, that you're going to be able to move the needle there on ESG.
We have a few other questions that have come up in the Q&A. So if Anna, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to the greenwashing comment, but if not, I'll move to the other questions that we've got.
No, I agree with everything that was said. You do your best to explain the risks. You might come up with examples of better disclosure, for example, that you can persuade your client to get comfortable with and maybe move it a little bit in that direction. But at the end of the day, we have to accept that this has always been true, right? If your role is the lawyer role, you're at the end of the day going to be limited in what you can do when it ends up being a business decision, if you want, and you're unable to have the last word, and that's life.
Yeah. So one panelist noted, Patricia Sulzer noted that often lawyers can be discouraged from getting ahead of their clients politically, or sort of being seen to be pushing their clients into a direction they might not be ready to go. And Mateo addressed that a little bit, but Shuangjun, as I was just saying, that your head is nodding. So does that resonate with you, that there's a balance there? Is that something that you have any advice for folks on, or something that you've encountered?
Yeah, it is definitely something I've encountered. I work with a broad spectrum of companies in different industries. And as you can imagine, some of them are much further, on the sort of ESG initiative scale spectrum than others. And it is one thing that we do have to balance as lawyers, to really tailor the advice that we give to the company, so that, like Mateo says, if you give advice, no matter how good it is, if it falls on deaf ears, or if they're unwilling to entertain what you're saying, then they're just wasted words. And so the way that I try to think about this is, look, for companies that have demonstrated they are very committed to ESG and they're really far ahead of the game, I give them different advice than I would give someone who's just starting out, who's very reluctant, who might be dragging their feet. And, it's really thinking about knowing the client, understanding their business, understanding how management and the board thinks about their business and their strategies, and trying to be creative about, maybe we're not taking large steps for some of these companies, we're taking baby steps. And really trying to insert, small things that they can do to sort of begin to integrate some of these. And some of it is, like Anna said, you want to issue spot and you want to identify, the risks and say, look, here are some areas of low hanging fruit where you can really easily address some of these major risks that we're looking at. And once you're doing that, then we can talk about slowly building in other things, and it's a much slower progression. And here I think the patience really comes into play, that was discussed earlier. But you're right that, lawyers are often discouraged, and, sometimes we are shut down. We try to start that conversation and they say, look, that's not something that's a priority for us. And we say, okay, well, maybe not today. And we'll find opportunities, if we are patient, to try and be the advisors to help them when they are ready to be helped. And sometimes we try to nudge them. I know at Cleary, we do a number of business development efforts, for example, where, if we see something happening in the market, and ESG events are always happening, there are a lot of developments, we might call up some of the clients that we think might be especially exposed or might be interested in these things, and might say, look, how about we do a quick training for you, or a quick presentation to the board to help you just to educate, and to really help you understand what's going on, help you understand the risks and the considerations here. And maybe that sparks something in, in some person in-house that leads to, more initiatives or the start of another project or something like that.
Right. So managing the messaging and educating sounds like two strategies that you all employ. So we have one more question in the chat and only a few more minutes. So I want to make certain that we at least air this question. So Christina Schwartz asked, sees a barrier to development of ESG and impact investing practices at small and mid-sized firms that not a lot of investors want to pay for legal services. And so that tension about paying for legal services pushes a lot of the work into the pro bono space, which keeps development out of the smaller and mid-sized firms. So she's asking the panelists, do you have any advice for how to help investors see the value in paying for legal services?
I actually don't have an answer to that question, but I'd like to say that, for example, I do think that there are many social enterprises. Mujer is one case where we do pay sometimes for legal services. Sometimes you want to make sure that you have, the top of mind priority attention that you may feel you're not getting from a big law firm, or there's a unique problem or a smallish deal that is not appropriate for a big law firm, and you expect not to pay big law firm rates, quite frankly, when you hire a smaller place. But I think there is room for that to occur.
I mean, I was in the same situation. Like, if I try to go to the principals and say that, I need $250,000 to like build out the practice, they would, kick me out of there. I mean, this is 7 years ago, and maybe things would be different if I did it today. But there's an incredible body of work out there. Like the SASB group is amazing. I did everything. I attended all their events, pulled all their documents. They have these engagement guides. There's all the DFIs produce like amazing bodies of sort of questionnaires to ask, and then from there, you have your question base and you start building up your policy. So I think, it's hard. Ideally, we have unlimited budget. But I hear you. I've dealt with the very similar issue, and I was just was out there in the industry conferences like this. Hey, can you share me a policy? Make friends, and the like. And but it's tough.
Yeah. So one thing that I was hoping to ask you all is, like, if you had one piece of advice for somebody wanting to break into this space, to either something to develop or knowledge. But Mateo, you just mentioned the SASB group and DFI's questionnaires and body of work. But if anybody has another suggestion for somebody who is wanting to build up their knowledge or their skills in this area, if you've got a quick recommendation, I'd love to end on that.
My quick recommendation is just reach out and to people that you know in this space, reach out, network, build that network, because I mean, I do it still, right? Because, there's so much knowledge out there. There's so much expertise, and I can spend hours reading myself. But it's really great to also share knowledge, because as we've said, a lot of these are judgment calls. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so just hearing thoughts from other people who are also thinking about these issues, or if you're trying to learn about things in this space, hearing the opinions of people who are already in this space, I think is really invaluable.
Great, thank you. Well, we are right at our 12 o'clock time. So I'll just thank our panelists for being a part of this, and thank all the participants. And I hope everybody is able to stay and participate in the case study that will follow this. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you for a panel that made me, and I'm sure most of our audience, if not all of them, very proud to be lawyers.